Ciao, ciao, ciao! Here we are, second class, weekly wine flights, cellar chats, and we're back to Italy. Never ends, never gets old. Always happy to be here. This week we're doing a little bit of a producer spotlight, if you will, and we're going all in on one of my favorites from the Veneto Pra wines. So we're going to do a white and a couple of reds and have a little fun. So this week to kick it off, we're going to start off with Pra's Soave Classico, which is called the Otto. So this is, not to continue using the same words over and over again, but this is pretty classic Soave. Yes, I know it's called Soave Classico. That is its own little category. But Soave is one of those wines that I think that still suffers from a long misconceived and, frankly deserved, but it's not the case anymore, idea of what Soave is. So in the 80s, I think it was the 80s or the 70s, basically around the time when red checker cloth, pizza joints, Italian restaurants where they had straw basket, Chiantis, and basically the white was Soave. And 99.9% of the time it was, for lack of a better word, garbage. But that is not the case anymore. I mean, frankly, there is garbage wine everywhere and available from any place on the world. Doesn't matter how prestigious or amazing it is. Somebody's not making very good wine and trying to profit off of it. But there are other producers in some of these regions, like Pra, Graziano Pra, who founded this estate, who make really incredible wines that showcase what is so special about these places and why we should pay attention to them. So they're the main grape varieties in Soave for white wine production are Garganiga, Garganiga, Trebbiano di Soave, and there's one other grape variety that my brain just cannot remember for the life of me. And to be honest, it doesn't get used all that often. For his entry level, it is 100% Garganiga, and then he makes 2 or 3 more step-ups that have a little bit of Trebbiano di Soave, not to be confused with Trebbiano Toscano, or one of the other 4,000 Trebbianos in Italy. This is Trebbiano di Soave, which is synonymous with the grape found just south of here in the Marche called Verdicchio, which is a really complex and amazing wine, or great for wine production. Oh, wow. So what really stands out for Pra, and they really got started focused in on white wines, and then in the last decade and a half they got into red wines, and we'll talk about that in a second. But they were really dedicated to white wine production, and they make some of Italy's best and most lauded Soaves and Soave Classicos and things of that nature, and really showcasing the complexity and the diversity that can be found throughout this region. His vineyards are located in cooler sites. There's a little bit more I want to say that it's volcanic limestone soils. So you get this underlying minerality to it. Garganiga is one of those grape varieties that kind of showcases where it's from quite well, but it always has this, to me, kind of a green almond bitterness that isn't necessarily bitter. It just adds a little complexity to the palate. The nose is bright and citrus, kind of more in that green citrus, less of a lemony citrus. So pretty. And again, I think I've said this before because we featured this wine. It's one of those wines that I like to transition people into after Pinot Grigio. And it's not that Pinot Grigio isn't good, but it's oftentimes when people get into wine and they start liking Pinot Grigio, it's typically the very basic, very simple, very kind of fruit-driven styles of Pinot Grigio. And those are perfectly fine. They're a great entry into white wines. They're a great entry into Italian white wines. But there's so much more to be had, and I find that Soave is kind of a nice, easy stepping stone to the next level. This wine still has good fruity crispness to it, but it's a little more complex. It's still relatively affordable. It's not going to be $5 on your retail shelf, but it's also not going to be $100, which is a nice step. And frankly, the wine is freaking delicious. I could drink this pretty much every day, but I say that about a lot of things, so I don't know how much sway that really goes for. Again, so that's the first wine on the lineup this week. The Soave Classico Otto, which, if I remember correctly, is named after his dog, which is actually on the back of the label. Super cute, right? Who doesn't like that? You know, winemakers and their dogs and naming things after their dogs. I mean, I'm not a dog person, but I think it's pretty freaking cute. Okay, so moving on, stepping up into Valpolicella. So Valpolicella, like Soave, is a region. So a little bit more specific about where we are. So we're in the Veneto. Where is the Veneto? It is basically the region that sits north and mostly west of the city of Venice. It is the closest wine region to Venice, and just across the border is Friuli. They kind of split. You'd have to look at a map. Just look at a map. It's hard to explain with my hands. So the Veneto is really known for, obviously, Soave, and then the most famous red wine would be Amarone del Valpolicella. So Valpolicella is the region. Amarone is a specific type of wine from Valpolicella. So, and here in the U.S., that is probably the red wine that most people are familiar with that has the name Valpolicella. Also Ripasso, which we're going to taste at the end here. But in Italy and the Veneto, the wine that most locals and the majority of people drink in this region, if they're drinking red, is just basic Valpolicella. And the reason being is that A, it's a little less expensive to produce, so it doesn't cost as much to drink. And B, well, a little bit of white wine left. And it's just a lighter, fresher red wine that is just makes more sense to be consumed on an everyday basis. Whereas, if you're not familiar, Amarone is a wine that's made from really ripe grapes that are then laid out on straw mats, or in some cases they're put into drying barns. It just depends on the producer. But essentially it is basically a wine that is produced from raisinated grapes. So they have to lose, I don't know the exact numbers, but a certain percentage of the water content of the grapes in order to be used for the production of Amarone. So what you get is a very concentrated, very deep, rich, sometimes very unctuous style of wine. And although those wines are very delicious, they're not exactly ideal for everyday drinking. And not to mention the process of taking, let's say we have 100 tons of grapes, okay? And this math is really not going to be right. And that 100 tons of grapes is going to make 10,000 bottles, okay? Just work with me here. But we need to lose 75% of the water content, which is the juice from these wines. So what was, 100 tons of grapes that would make 10,000 bottles is now going to make maybe 1,000 bottles. Again, my math, not good, but you get the idea. You're going to take the same amount of fruit that takes the same amount of effort and work and time and labor and all of these things, and you're going to get, 80% less product out of it. It's going to cost more. So that's really, outside of the fact that Amarone doesn't pair well with everything, it's just lucratively expensive. Just like any other prestigious wine, it's just very expensive. So it doesn't make sense to drink every day. So that was a very long, drawn-out story here. So what you get is this really light, kind of beautiful, crunchy, red-fruited, easy drinking wine from the same grape varieties. The primary grape varieties in this region are Rondinella, Corvinone, Corvina, and then Ossoletta, which that last one used to be used a lot less, but it's kind of coming back into fashion as climate change, changes the way we grow things and the way we look at things. Historically, it was a grape that didn't always ripen, but now that it takes a little longer to ripen, that's actually a good thing because it gives freshness to the wines. For me, these wines are so much fun to drink, especially as we get into the spring weather. I know I keep talking about that, but it's springtime. We got to think about these things. Classic, just straight Valpolicella is sort of like the Beaujolais of Italy, which is kind of dumbing it down, but you get the idea. It's light, it's fresh, it's crunchy, it's easy drinking. It is not done carbonic like you might think after I said that. But it just does a lot of those things. Higher acid, red fruits, easygoing, a little bit of a pepperiness to it. Oh, wow. And I always get like, not necessarily like bell pepper or like black pepper, but I get like an arugula, like kind of bitter green pepperiness that I personally find very appealing. It also works so well with food. I like it with a good chill. Oh, that is lovely. I mean, I know I'm biased, but man, is that good. Lots of like tart with two T's, T-A-R-T, tart, red berries, kind of raspberry, a little bit of a blackberry character, but more in that red fruit character, a little tart cherry. Wow, this is good. I really just like, I want everything. I want a whole smattering of cheese and meats and maybe some seafood, like nice piece of like grilled fish would be excellent with this wine. So again, that is number 2 in the lineup this week, the Pra Valpolicella Morandina. So on all of Pra's red wines, you will see the label Morandina. That is the name of the vineyard site that they own in the Valpolicella region. So as I mentioned, these guys really got started with white wine. I want to say late 70s, early 80s is when they kind of kickstarted the Pra estate. Focused on white wine all the way up until about early 2000s. And then they purchased a small estate in the Valpolicella region with some red grapes, some kind of older vine parcels, and a little bit higher up than some of the other producers, and on a little bit more, if I remember correctly, limestone soils. So you get this more linear, more vibrant, more fresh style of Valpolicella. Even though Amarone isn't nearly as unctuous and rich as some of the other producers in the area. I mean, some of that has to do with how they make their wines, but a lot of it has to do with like it's a cooler site, and it just lends itself to a lighter, fresher wine while still having those kind of classic like date raisinated characters. All right, so moving on from Valpolicella into Ripasso. So ripasso means to basically to pass again. So as I mentioned before, Amarone is made with, grapes that have been dried, and then they press the juice out and they make a wine from this very concentrated but very limited amount of juice. A ripasso is made with basically a fresh set of grapes that are pressed off, and then they add in the skins left over from Amarone, like raisinated. So these raisinated like skins and pumice, they add it in. So you're repassing wine through these grape skins. And what that does is it just gives a little bit more concentration, a little more richness to the wine. And it makes a wine that, for all intents and purposes, is kind of like a baby Amarone, which is, how most people in a retail store or in a restaurant would sell it, because I mean, it's not an accurate way to describe it, but it does kind of get the point across. And it has, one step shy of the richness and that complexity that you would get in an Amarone. But because it's made with both fresh and leftover raisinated grape skins, it's not as expensive to produce, so it's not as expensive to enjoy. So it kind of like hits that middle ground, whereas the classic Valpolicella, it's just really bright and fresh and crunchy. That's all like, fully just totally ripe grapes. Nothing has been raisinated or anything of that nature. And then Amarone would be all raisinated. Ripasso falls right in the middle. So you can even tell, if you kind of rewind, it's a little bit denser. It's a little darker in color. A little bit of richness to the color here. And even on the nose, it still has that kind of peppery characteristic that I think the classic Valpolicella has, but there you can tell there's a density to the wine that just isn't there in the traditional Valpolicella. Which is, for me, what kind of makes this flight fun is that you get to taste two reds, similar grape like kind of what's the word? Not makeup, but breakdown. So similar grape, amount of grape, percentage of grapes of like Rondinella, Corvinone. Man, that was hard for me to get out. But just treated in a very different way. And from basically the same site. I mean, this Morandina is really just one single site that they have in the Valpolicella area. Wow. And you get a little bit of that coffee, a little bit of licorice. There is kind of like a mild raisin type character, which you would expect from like an Amarone, but you still have vibrancy and freshness. Wow. So good. Yeah. The back end really comes in with more of that licorice, a little bit of cocoa powder kind of characteristic going on there, but still that like bright, fresh, like crunchy raspberry, a little bit of like tart cherries. This is very pretty. So good. Loving these wines. Okay, let's wrap up because I've been rambling for a while. Again, this week, the weekly flights at Second Glass. It's a producer spotlight. It's all about Pra, all about the Veneto. We kick it off. Soave Classico, their Otto, rolling into just really tasty, crunchy red Valpolicella from their Morandina estates. And then we step it up just a touch more with a Ripasso Valpolicella Superiore from their Morandina estate as well. Come out, have some flights, bring your friends, have some food, be good to each other, say hi to your friends, say hi to your family, and I'll see you next week.